The lighthouse stood tall and weathered on the edge of a rocky cliff, its once bright paint now chipped and faded. For years, it had been a silent sentinel, guiding ships safely to shore, but now it was abandoned, left to the elements and the passage of time. Its eerie history had earned it a reputation among the locals, who whispered of strange occurrences and restless spirits. This was precisely why Thomas, a struggling writer in search of inspiration, chose it as his retreat. Thomas arrived on a gray, overcast day, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. He unloaded his belongings and stepped inside, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. The interior was cold and musty, the air thick with the scent of the sea and decay. He set up his workspace in the small room at the top of the lighthouse, where the large windows offered a panoramic view of the turbulent ocean below. It was the perfect place to find solitude and hopefully finish his long overdue novel. Days turned into nights, and Thomas found himself increasingly drawn to the lighthouse's history. He discovered old journals and letters left behind by previous keepers, each one hinting at strange events and inexplicable phenomena. The deeper he delved into the past, the more he felt a presence within the walls, something watching him, waiting. One stormy night, as the wind howled and the waves crashed violently against the cliffs, Thomas sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop the only light in the room. He was deep in his writing when he heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. He paused, listening intently, but the sound was gone. Shaking off the unease, he continued to type, his fingers moving frantically over the keys. But the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in his mind. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer and more pronounced. Thomas looked around, his heart pounding. The air grew cold, and he could see his breath misting in the light. The whispers became a chorus, a deluge of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, the screen of his laptop flickered, and the words he had been typing began to change, morphing into something unrecognizable. Panicked, Thomas tried to stop, but his fingers moved of their own accord, typing out a nightmarish narrative that seemed to flow from the depths of his subconscious. The walls of the room began to ripple and twist, and the shadows coalesced into a dark, amorphous entity that hovered at the edge of his vision. The entity moved closer, its form shifting and writhing like a mass of black smoke. It whispered in Thomas's ear, its voice a chilling blend of malice and seduction. The line between reality and his imagination blurred, and he felt himself being drawn into the story he was writing. Unable to distinguish between what was real and what was fiction, desperate to escape, Thomas fled from the room, racing down the winding staircase of the lighthouse. But the entity followed, its presence growing stronger with each step. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in on him, the once familiar structure transforming into a terrifying nightmare. He could hear the whispers all around him, the voices of the past keepers trapped within the lighthouse, their souls consumed by the same entity that now pursued him. Thomas burst through the door at the base of the lighthouse and stumbled into the stormy night. The wind and rain lashed at his face, but he didn't stop, running blindly across the rocky terrain. He reached the edge of the cliff, the churning ocean below a dark, menacing void. Behind him, the entity loomed, its form towering and oppressive. With nowhere left to run, Thomas turned to face the entity, his fear giving way to a desperate resolve. He screamed into the storm, his voice lost in the roar of the wind and waves. The entity surged forward, its tendrils reaching out to envelop him. In that moment, Thomas felt his mind break, the boundary between reality and imagination shattering completely. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the lighthouse stood silent once more. The locals found Thomas's belongings, but there was no sign of the writer himself. Some said he had fled, driven mad by the isolation. while others whispered that the lighthouse had claimed another victim, the latest in a long line of souls lost to its malevolent presence. The lighthouse remains, a brooding monument to the past, its eerie history growing with each passing year. And on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the waves crash against the cliffs, some say you can still hear the whispers, the voices of those trapped within its walls, their stories forever entwined with the dark, amorphous entity that dwells in the shadows.